A short-term effect. Hocus Pocus Fanfiction. Normally, Catherine wasn't one to spend her nights in cemeteries, much less on Halloween night. It just seemed tacky. But Beth and Carolyn had it in their heads to come out here with a Ouija board to see what they could conjure up. Alright, that was a bad joke around these parts, in a town infamous for its witch legends. Even sillier now that there was nothing left to conjure. Oh yes, Catherine knew all about what went down on All Hallows Eve back in 1993. She'd been just a child then, but a rather adept child, and she'd been exempt from the Sanderson sisters' ploys for immortality. After all, weak spells from the 17th century could do little harm to a modern witch. Best keep that information to herself, though, she grinned ruefully. Kicking a pebble, she meandered down the gravel path that wound toward some of the town's older graves. Salem had really cashed in on the witch thing after the infamous trials, and a horde of so-called witches and Wiccans had invaded, intent on carving out their own little niche in the city and profiting off unsuspecting tourists, luring them into incense-fogged shops of crystals and wands. Catherine rather despised them. She had nothing against the nature-loving mannerisms of the Wiccans, of course, but the way they attempted to claim and covet the title of witch, to the point of excluding all other paths, well, it irked her. On the other hand, there were the fanatics that claimed that all witchcraft was of the devil, and often used the legends of the Sanderson sisters to exemplify their point. It was as though the town was split down the middle, two warring factions, like Romeo and Juliet. For her part, Catherine paid them no mind. Here, she stopped to take a break and rest her weary feet. Her lace-up Fluvog boots cut into her ankle something terrible, and so she often only pulled them out on special occasions. But it was Samhain, which was a perfectly acceptable occasion to doll up in her gothic best. With a great sigh, she perched herself on the edge of one of the more decrepit headstones. She was certainly living up to all her stereotypes tonight, wasn't she? In a graveyard after an uneventful seance on Halloween night with her witchiest boots and a simple long black dress. She tossed a velvet coat over her shoulders for added warmth and tied her curly auburn hair up into some semblance of a messy bun. Grandma would be appalled, she snickered out loud. Her amusement gave way to confusion, and then borderline terror as the grave she was seated before began to heave upwards. She watched in mute horror as the ground cracked and handfuls of dirt rolled off to the sides. There was a great groaning, the sound of ancient wood rending itself apart, and finally, a head of unruly dark hair emerged from the recently formed hole, followed by a wiry pair of shoulders. William Butcherson, she breathed. The head turned, and a face drawn and pinched by centuries of death entered her view. He stared at her quizzically for a few moments, and then in a rough voice, rough as gravel, asked, "Who are you?" There was a moment where she couldn't move. Another moment where Catherine realized she was sitting on the headstone of a, likely, very disgruntled zombie. After that little tidbit finally sank in, she leapt from her stone perch and nearly toppled over backwards. Holy shit, holy shit, holy shit! It came out as a gasped tumble of cuss words. William Butcherson was the beau of Winifred Sanderson, and he had purportedly committed unspeakable crimes during his life. His undoing, as rumor would have it, was his secret affair with Sarah, the prettiest of the sisters. When Winifred had discovered this, she'd poisoned her lover and sewn his lips shut so that even in the afterlife he'd tell no tales. "That's right, dead men tell no tales," she whispered. By this point, the lanky corpse was stumbling to an upright position, and she got a good look at the man. He was tall, thin, and covered in dirt. After shaking himself off, he turned to look at her. Underneath the long mop of what was once probably rich dark brown hair, sunken blue eyes peered at her. "Your name, lass?" "I'm Catherine." She finally found her voice again. "And you're dead." He turned to look down at his grave, and then back up at her. "Aye," he nodded. "Been a spell since I last crawled out of there, I reckon." Speaking of reckoning, Catherine was having some difficulty with the whys and hows of his current wakeful state. She would have remembered summoning a ghoul from his resting place, and recalling the night's events, she could really come to no conclusion about her involvement unless... Oh no. Billy mistook her quiet utterance for fear and was quick to placate. "Don't worry now, lass," he croaked. "I ain't gonna hurt ya." She didn't even hear him, mind puzzling out the state of things and fitting the pieces neatly in their slots. The Ouija board session she'd participated in, however bemusedly, with her two friends earlier that night, seemed to have stirred things up after all. Oh, what a silly chit she could be, hardly pausing to think what the implications of her merely being present could mean. Controlled as she might believe herself to be, it was Halloween, she was a witch, and nothing was safe this night. The zombie watched her eyes grow distant and for a moment wondered if she was perhaps a bit touched in the head. But when her gaze landed on him again, her eyes had cleared. "I'm sorry," she said. "I think this whole situation is my fault. I didn't mean to summon the dead, honestly, but..." With a sheepish grin, she continued, "These things do happen." It took Billy a moment to understand her words, but when he did, he fixed her with his best scowl. "So you're a witch too, then? A she-devil like the others? Wicked trollops, hags, the lot of 'em?" She let him have his moment, knew perfectly well his attitude toward the witchy folk was justified. He muttered for a few more moments before turning his attention back to her. His voice was low and threatening when he next spoke, and Catherine had the good sense to be alarmed. "What nefarious purpose you got in store for me, then?" She blinked stupidly. "Purpose? What? No, I told you this was an accident. I honestly didn't mean to. This kind of thing just isn't my style." "And what is your thing?" He strode towards her, watching her step lightly back onto the gravel path as he closed in. "Killing the young ones, seducing the menfolk, poisoning the village, reaping all manner of mayhem on the innocent?" He was before her now, towering over her small black-clad frame. Her eyes were wide, and she was breathing shallowly. "No one's innocent." He pulled up short, blue eyes piercing hers. "Nay." "No way." "Not all witches are evil, though, William," she reassured. "I may not be innocent, but I'm not evil. I spend more time hiding my powers than using them, and certainly not for any so-called nefarious purposes." "That's so." He wanted to believe her. He did, but experience told him that the pretty girls were often the most wicked, and the most likely to spin a web of beautiful lies around a man. "What do you use them for, then?" She stepped back, away from the stench of decay and distrust. Her eyes scanned the area, searching for a way to show him something. Ah, yes, the leaves. The trees had been dropping golden, yellow, and red leaves for the better part of October now, and they were scattered across the ground around them. She'd make them dance. Closing her eyes, she let out a deep breath and focused. Even during the years he'd lived, he'd never seen a thing more serene or beautiful. At first, the wind merely began to howl, pulling and tugging at his frayed coat and jabbet, and then, like a cyclone, everything around them began to spin. The tattered leaves on the ground flew up and about, dancing in a circle. Fireflies, or what looked like fireflies, mingled among them, spinning wildly to a tune only they could hear. And this witch, this Catherine, stood in the center of it all, with her eyes closed and a smile gracing her ruby-painted lips. Then, as if remembering her situation, her eyes opened and the wind abruptly ceased. "That's the sort of thing I use them for," she said simply. Then she turned on her heel and made as if to leave. "If you want to return to your slumber, do so. I won't stop you." He hesitated, looking down at the gaping hole in the earth that he currently called home, and back up to the retreating figure of the girl who'd just dazzled him. It didn't take him long to decide, and he was stumbling forward after her. When Catherine heard the shuffling footsteps behind her, she turned, disbelief painting her features. "Really?" she wailed. "What do you want now, zombie?" He huffed in annoyance at her insulting word choice. "I'm looking to find some friends I made last time I was up. Don't suppose you'd help me find them." "Friends?" She raised an eyebrow skeptically. "I would assume any friends you had in your past life are long dead by now." He shook his head, sending grave dust everywhere. "No, I know them from the night they sent those wicked hags back to hell. Max and Danny, their names were." "Ah, well that made a grand deal more sense now, didn't it?" Now Catherine understood why Billy hadn't been nearly as surprised as she to find himself out of the grave. Again, apparently. So he had been present that night. She supposed Winifred must have summoned him from beyond to do her bidding, seeing as she was dead and Billy had a good deal of heated words on the subject of witches. She suspected he wasn't very compliant towards said bidding. She kept this to herself, of course. Max and Danny, she trolled. Max and Danny. She was certain those names were familiar to her, but she had a hard time finding faces for them. Tell me about this Danny, she sounds familiar. Billy was only too glad to comply. He told her all about the young girl who befriended him, as well as the lad named Max and his lovely girlfriend. Catherine listened pensively as they walked, and grew more and more frustrated as she tried to remember how she knew the name Danny. With a low snarl, she whipped her cell phone out of her jacket pocket and rounded on Billy. Hush up for a moment, she told him, and began to furiously rifle through her contacts. If anyone knew this Danny, it was probably her good friend Lacey. Lacey, ironically, was head over heels in love with the idea of witches and knew everything about everything regarding the town's legends. If anyone knew about a girl named Danny involved with the Sanderson sisters, it was her. The phone rang several times before a groggy voice seeped into her ear. What the hell, Kate? I'm sorry to wake you at such a late hour. She tried to sound placating. But would you happen to know of a girl named Danny lived or lives in town somewhere? Strawberry blonde hair? Lacey perked up at this. You probably mean Danny Dennison. Possibly? Did she have an older brother named Max? She did, Lacey affirmed. But Max was killed in a car accident 2 years ago, and Danny went to New York for university. I haven't talked to her since then. Why do you want to know? Catherine sighed. Just helping out someone who was looking for them. I figured you might know. Sorry I couldn't be of more help, Lacey said, a yawn distorting her words. I'm going to go back to sleep now, okay? Thanks, Catherine mumbled and flipped her phone shut. Well, I'm afraid I have some bad news for you, William. They sat outside the cemetery on the bus stop bench. The night had grown quiet. Gone were the revelers and done were the festivities. This was a residential neighborhood, Catherine noted. All these families would be asleep now. Not that she really had to worry. Sure, Billy was a horrific-looking walking corpse. But this was Halloween, and no one would be the wiser. Come morning, though. So what happens when the sun comes up? She pondered aloud. Billy looked at her a moment, and then went back to the scene before him. He really had no idea. Last time he'd been woken up, he'd gone right back to a dead sleep after the witches were rendered to dust and the sun touched his parched skin. Would the same thing happen now? Suppose I'll go back, he said quietly. There was really no point in staying there and wandering the streets of Salem after all. Catherine nodded. That would probably be for the best. Zombies had become quite the rage in pop culture media, but she doubted Billy would have an easy time of it if he hung around. There was no way he could pass for a living, not even on his best day. Her lips twisted into a wistful smile. Shame, he probably had some fascinating stories to tell. When the sun finally rose, she let out a loud yawn and stood up. Every muscle in her body protested at the action. She stretched a little further in an attempt to loosen things up. Billy rose also, albeit more gracefully, which she found amusing. They looked at each other for a moment, neither really knowing what to say or how to end their little encounter. Finally, she smiled. I suppose you should be off then, eh? I need to get home as well. I can't believe I've been up all night. He nodded. Aye, get some rest, lass. Hesitating for barely a moment, Catherine leaned closer and placed a chaste kiss on Billy's cheek. Eyes wide, he turned to look at her, but she was already pulling back and cinching her coat tighter around her thin body. Farewell, William. She watched him retreat back into the cemetery, and when he was nearly out of view, left for home. As Billy clumsily sank back down into his grave and closed his eyes, he remarked upon something. It had been a long time since anyone had called him William. He supposed he might miss it.